here's Michael Smerconish.
COVID-19 infection versus vaccination, which carries stronger immunity. Finally, a great piece with all the latest data has been published in the Wall Street Journal. Denise Roland wrote it and joins me to discuss. Denise, I can't tell you how often this has come up on my radio program where we'll be talking about vax mandates or some type of policy where people have to prove that they've been vaccinated in order to engage in an activity. And I'll get a telephone call from someone who will say, well, I had COVID. Maybe I wasn't inoculated, but I've had COVID. What about me? And I've been hard pressed to give them an explanation or an answer. What caused you to want to take a look at this?
It was exactly the same thing. Every time I write about, I'm the pharmaceuticals reporter based in Europe for the Wall Street Journal. And when I write about vaccines and immunity, I'll get a ton of emails from readers saying, what about immunity from infection? So that's what set me off looking into this.
Do you know whether any country treats the same way those who've been inoculated as those who've had COVID in the past?
A lot of European countries do. So here in the UK, you can prove immunity through having a PCR positive test within the last 6 months. It's COVID recovered. In France and Germany, there are restrictions on going into bars and restaurants, but you can go in if you've been vaccinated or if you're recovered from the disease. So here in Europe, it's actually quite common.
And is there, wow, that's fascinating to me because I didn't realize that. Is there some type of a tail on that policy? You referenced 6 months in the UK. Do you need to have had COVID within 6 months in order for that level of protection to give you access?
Yeah, well, currently that's where they've landed on the policy. And I think it's just because, 6 months is broadly, there's sort of enough evidence, 6 months old to say that. That's not to say it couldn't last longer, but, when it comes to kind of evidence that we can be confident about, the consensus seems to be that we can be broadly confident that at the 6 month mark, the two are roughly equivalent.
The lead of your piece in the Wall Street Journal, which I've made available in my social media and really encourage people to read, said this: evidence is building that immunity from COVID-19 infection is at least as strong as that from vaccination. Scientists are divided on the implications for vaccine policy. Explain.
Yeah, so, nobody's done the definitive study to say, for sure vaccination is stronger than infection or vice versa. But there are studies out there and, they broadly divide into two camps that are looking at both types of immunity, and taken together, they suggest that they're roughly equivalent. There are sort of some studies that just zoom right out like 10,000 feet and sort of say people who've had vaccination or people who've had an infection, let's see who's more likely to test positive later on. And, there's an Israeli study that was like that. The Office for National Statistics here in the UK tracks that kind of data. And those studies suggest it's equivalent, potentially that immunity from prior infection is even a little bit stronger. And then there are like really close-up studies where, scientists looking at the blood of the people who've recovered and figure out what's going on with their immune cells. And, they find interesting evidence to suggest that, immunity from infection, it's different from immunity from vaccination, and that they do have different strengths from each other.
Right. But isn't it a very individual answer in terms of how long you'll be protected if you've had it as compared to a vaccination? In other words, doesn't the data present a pretty clear picture as to how long you'll be protected if you're properly vaccinated? But with regard to someone who's had it, it's very dependent upon their individual circumstances.
Yeah, so this is the part of the public health argument for keeping it simple and advocating for universal vaccination. With the vaccine, that you're kind of getting a fixed dose of antigen and you'll respond. I mean, everyone responds slightly different to vaccination, but the dose is fixed. So there's a level of consistency there. There is a concern that with infection, you don't really know clearly yet whether people who've had a mild infection hardly have any immune response and people who've had a very bad infection have a very strong one. So this is part of the argument, I think, for keeping it simple with universal vaccination, because it's not as reliable or consistent.
What I took away from your reporting is that the safer path the safer path is to get vaccinated, right? Get vaccinated. Now you're protected. You get COVID maybe on a breakthrough, but you probably won't be hospitalized. You probably won't have a severe illness. And you overwhelmingly, the odds are you're not going to die. But do the people who've had the virus themselves need a full course? And should that count against a mandate? What about somebody who has had it? Do they nevertheless need two, unless it's the J&J inoculation, 2 shots plus a booster like we're now being recommended?
Yeah, I mean, there are scientists out there who would advocate for a single shot of one of, the mRNA vaccines post if you've had the infection, because they've shown that, you get a top up of your antibodies from one dose. A subsequent dose doesn't do much else for you. So why go through the extra risk of side effects or unpleasant, feeling terrible for a day or two if you don't have to. So yeah, there's evidence out there to suggest that one dose would be plenty. But I think the reason the policy is the way it is because there's a sort of elegance in the simplicity of it and an easiness of, digesting it. But it seems like, a more nuanced strategy, could be feasible given what we know about immunity from infection.
Is it fair to say that immunity from infection has not been studied as voluminously as immunity after vaccination? And that's one of the reasons why this is so difficult to come to concrete answers?
Yeah, well, with the vaccines, we were able to run, randomized controlled trials, like the gold standard type of trial to sort of show, give people a vaccine, you give people a placebo, you compare how they do. That's like, the gold standard scientific trial. You can't, intentionally infect someone with COVID and track them in the same way. So you're relying on different sorts of studies. And as more people get vaccinated, it's harder to find people who aren't and, figure out what's going on there. So I think, we've got more data on vaccine mediated immunity, but there is, it's not to say that evidence about immunity from infection isn't out there and doesn't exist, and that there might not be more coming out as well, because there are folks who have decided not to get a vaccine who have had an infection, and those folks can be tracked. So yeah, I think there's less evidence, but there's a growing amount of it showing a bit about both types of immunity.
What is immune memory? You use those words in your piece, immune memory.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and explain this, although I'm not an immunologist, but the first response when the virus gets into your body, your immune system develops these like antibodies to try and fight it off as a front line. But what happens then is that there's this sort of cell called a memory B cell, and their job is to kind of basically store knowledge about that virus. They kind of lay in wait in your body. After you've had the infection, you've recovered, they lay in wait and are kind of ready for the next time you encounter that virus. So what the Rockefeller research found that I referenced in the piece was in people who'd recovered from COVID, those memory B cells kind of kept working on, finding new approaches to kind of come at the virus. That response sort of evolved over time. They think that might be because bits of virus stay in your body after an infection. Whereas after a vaccination, there'll be a certain amount of laying down that memory, but then it doesn't change very much over time. So that's the memories what we rely on the next time we see the virus.
So is the immune memory, as you've just explained it, stronger for someone who's had the virus or someone who's had the vaccination?
So the Rockefeller researchers argue that it would appear stronger in folks who've had an infection. And that's because it sort of continues to evolve and become more sophisticated and also more broad. So it kind of, the next time someone who's had the infection meets the virus, that antibody response that will suddenly be kicked into action is a broader one. It's got more diversity, so it might be a higher quality response. It's not to say that there is immune memory in people who've had the vaccine as well, but it won't be as broad. So there's a difference there. Interestingly, the vaccines, though, have the upper hand when it comes to that initial antibody response. So there's that kind of, pluses and minuses to both types.
And Denise, I fully respect that you're not an immunologist. Denise Roland from the Wall Street Journal has just written a great piece gathering together all the latest thinking and data science on this issue of how should we regard those with a natural immunity in comparison to those who've been inoculated. I know that when this subject has come up on the past and on radio, I get phone calls from scientists, physicians who say, well, there's really not a test that tells us if you've had it, what level of antibody response you continue to have in your body today. I feel like I'm asking that very awkwardly, but my question to you is there a test that today tells me my body's ability to fight the virus where I've had it in the past?
The short answer is no. So you can detect for antibodies, you can see if you've got some in your blood. What isn't clear yet is, the concentration that you would need to have in your blood to protect you. Not partly because we don't know exactly what, that level is, but it's also because it's dependent on the dose of virus that you encounter. So say you get it from a brief encounter with somebody and it's a few virus particles, you might not need so many antibodies to just flush that out. If you're spending hours in a crowded restaurant and you've been breathing in virus all evening, that's going to be quite a high dose and you'll need more antibodies in your blood. So it's partly because it depends on your circumstances, but we don't really know what kind of protective level in circulating in your blood is. Then the sort of next question is, if it does get in and take hold, is your memory immune response good enough to then fight that off? So at least it stops you from getting ill badly. And that's a sort of different question as well. So it's quite complex, and there isn't a single test to say you're immune, you're fine, you won't get it,
Well, and that's what brings us back then to what I think you described as the one size fits all approach, which is to say that it's much simpler and buttoned up to say everyone should get immunized because of the individual nature of a response by natural immunity, right? No two responses are the same. So you can't say that two people who've had it 5 months ago are necessarily in the same position today. Listen, I feel like I've led you with my questioning. So I have a final question. I'm going to wipe the slate clean. Imagine that together we were having a beer at a pub where you are in Northern Ireland. And I said to you as a friend, hey, you just wrote this piece. What's the takeaway? What is it that people most need to know about natural immunity in comparison to vaccination?
So I think the most important takeaway is that it's not an either or question. So if you're thinking about how do I get immunity to the virus, the answer is clear that the best way of acquiring immunity is to get vaccinated. If you've got a prior infection, you're thinking, am I protected from the virus? The answer seems to be probably about as well as somebody who's been vaccinated. But, if you want to get a vaccine on top of that, it's a belt and braces approach. And, the vaccines, obviously, the harm from them is not zero, but it's very small. So, if you wanted to take extra precautions, why not get a vaccine? I think that's, where it ends. And it gets more complex when you talk about mandates and that sort of thing. From a sort of perspective of like what the evidence would suggest you should do, I think that's it.
Denise, are the people who are, based on your conversations with scientists and physicians, are the people who are in the best position today those who had the virus and got vaccinated thereafter?
Yeah, so studies have shown that these people do have a very strong immunity, to the virus, because they'll have had this initial response, and then the vaccine boosts those antibody levels well beyond what vaccination or infection alone would do. So this, what's so-called hybrid immunity, seems to be the strongest form.
Got it. A final question, and you've been gracious with your time. I mean it this time. Why hasn't the United States done what the European nations that you've referenced have done in giving some allowance, some slack to people who've had it?
I don't know the answer to that precisely. I mean, with public health folk I speak to, the key concern about introducing different rules for infection from prior immunity is simply a kind of complication and the risk of inadvertently encouraging folks to go and get infected on purpose. So there's this concern, I think, that if that was brought into the picture, it would muddy it and make it overly complicated and could have this sort of unintended harm.
That was excellent. Thank you so much for what you wrote for the journal and your willingness to come by and discuss it. We appreciate it very much.
Lovely to talk. Thanks so much for having me on.